When the first COVID-19 vaccine became available, the challenge was getting enough vaccines to help all the people who were wanting a shot. Now there are plenty of shots and not enough people willing to get one. Today, Johns Hopkins doctors discussed possible approaches to tackle vaccine hesitancy. Some of the ideas floated were community outreach, incentive programs, and single-dose options. One of the first steps, figuring out who the trusted voices are in the vaccine-averse communities.
I think it's really important for us to identify who are the trusted messengers for different groups of people. We might make assumptions about who might be a trusted messenger, but that it might not actually be the messenger that we think is trusted for a particular group.
On today's call, the doctors also talked about addressing racial inequity far more broadly.